Hey, profane. Whoops. I'm not hearing
Hello?
audio.
Hello?
Oh, now I can hear you. Yeah.
Was my microphone not working?
I didn't hear audio.
Hello?
I didn't. Can you hear me?
Hello?
Hello?
Hello? Hello?
Hi. Maybe it's my audio. Sorry.
Oh, it isn't working. Bloody hell.
Hello?
Testing. One, two, three.
I can hear you, but
Yes? But
can you hear
what?
me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. Earlier I couldn't hear you. I thought maybe it was me, but
No, it's not you. It's me. For some reason, my microphone cuts out. So I have been
okay.
reading for X amount of time now.
Okay. I thought so. It looked like it. Yeah. But I didn't hear anything. I checked the YouTube and I don't think there was audio there either. So I came
No,
back here.
no, no. It's the same. It's the same. I don't know what this is. I have to fix it somehow. I thought I had fixed it, but I didn't. So
It's
here we
like,
go.
all right.
Sorry. Thank you very
Cool.
much.
Yeah.
This quantitative varied to the quota of social labor time devoted to the various particular series of production is merely a further developed expression of the law of value in general, even though necessary labor time takes on a different meaning here. Only such and such a quantity of this is necessary for the satisfaction of the social need. The limit in this case is brought to light through the use value. Under the given conditions of production, society can spend only so much of its total labor time on one particular kind of product. But the subjective and objective conditions of surplus value and surplus labor in general have nothing to do with the particular form, whether this is profit or rent. They apply to surplus value as such, whatever particular form this may assume. They therefore do not explain rent. Number three, a particular peculiarity which arises very clearly with the economic valorization of landed property, that is to say, the development of ground rent, is that its amount, irrespective of who receives it, is in no way determined by the action of its recipient, but rather by a development of social labor which is independent of him and in which he plays no part. This is why something that is common to all branches of production and their products is on the basis of commodity production and to capitalist production in particular, which is commodity production in its entirety, is easily conceived as a peculiar property of rent and of the product of agriculture in general. The value of rent, and with it the value of land, rises in the course of social development as a result of the labor of the whole of society. Not only does the market and demand for agricultural products grow, but also the demand for the land itself grows directly, since it is a condition of production competed for by all possible branches of business, including non-agricultural ones. More precisely, rent, and with it the value of the land, confining ourselves simply to agricultural rent proper, develops along with the market for the products of the land, and hence along with the growth in the non-agricultural population. It increases with their needs and their demand, both for foodstuffs and for raw materials. It lies in the nature of the capitalist mode of production that it constantly reduces the agricultural population in relation to the non-agricultural population, because here in industry, the growth of constant capital in relation to variable is linked with an absolute growth in variable capital, even if a relative decline in relation to constant. While there, in agriculture, the variable capital required for the cultivation of a particular piece of land declines absolutely and therefore grows only insofar as new land is cultivated, which, however, presupposes in turn a still greater growth in the non-agricultural population. In actual fact, however, The same thing happens not just to the products of agriculture, but to all other products produced on the basis of commodity production and its absolute form, the capitalist mode of production. These products are commodities, that is, use values which possess an exchange value, and particularly one that can be realized, that is, converted into money, only and exclusively to the extent to which other commodities form an equivalent for them and other products confront them as commodities and as values, to the extent, therefore, to which they are not produced as direct means of subsistence for the producers themselves, but as commodities, as products which only become use values for their producers by being transformed into exchange value money by their alienation. The market for these commodities develops by way of the social division of labor. The separation between different productive labors transforms their respective products reciprocally into commodities, into equivalents from one another, making them serve one another reciprocally as markets. This is in no way something peculiar to the producers of agriculture. Rent can develop as money rent only on the basis of commodity production, and particularly of capitalist production, and it develops to the same extent to which agricultural production becomes commodity production, i.e., the extent to which non-agricultural production undergoes an independent development in relationship to it. For it is to this extent, and only to this extent, that the product of agriculture becomes a commodity and a value. To the same extent that commodity production, and hence the production of value, develops with capitalist production, so too there develops the production of surplus value and surplus product. But in the same measure as the latter develops, that is surplus product, there develops in landed property the ability to capture a growing portion of this surplus value by way of its monopoly of the earth, and hence to raise the value of its rent and the price of the land itself. It is the capitalist himself who has the active function in the development of the surplus value and surplus product. The landowner has only to seize a portion of the surplus product and the surplus value that increases without any effort on his part. This is the peculiarity of his position, not the fact that the value of the agricultural products, and hence of the land itself, is constantly growing as the market for these expands. Demand increases, and with it the world of commodities that confronts the products of agriculture. In other words, the number of non-agricultural commodity producers and the scale of non-agricultural commodity production. Now, since this happens without his assistance, however, it appears that the landowner is something unique, that the mass of value, that is the mass of surplus value, and the transformation of a portion of this surplus value into rent, depends on the social production process, on the development of commodity production in general. That is why Dove, for example, would like to explain rent on this basis. Footnote, endnote 22. He says that rent does not depend on the size of the agricultural product. He says that rent does not depend on the size of the agricultural product, but rather on its value. This, however, depends on the size and productivity of the non-agricultural population. But it is also true to say that for any product, that it only develops as a commodity in part with the volume and in part with the diversity of the series of other commodities that form equivalents for it. We have already shown this in our general presentation of value. On the one hand, the exchangeability of a product depends entirely on the multifariousness of the different commodities that exist outside it. On the other hand, the quantity in which it can itself be produced as a commodity depends in turn on this exchangeability. No producer, neither the manufacturer nor the cultivator considered in isolation, produces a value or a commodity. Their product becomes a value and a commodity only in a specific social context. Firstly, insofar as it appears as an expression of social labor, and therefore their own labor time appears as part of the general social labor time. Secondly, where the social character of their labor appears as a social character impressed on their product in its money character and its general exchangeability as determined by its price. Thus, if on the one hand, instead of explaining rent, it is surplus value, or in a still more blinkered conception, surplus product in general that is being explained, then on the other hand, the blunder is committed of ascribing a character that applies to all products as commodities and values exclusively to the products of agriculture. The superficiality is heightened when a retreat is made from the general determination of value to the realization of a particular commodity value. A commodity can realize its value only in the process of circulation, and whether and to what extent it does realize this depends on the market conditions at the time. Thus, it is not peculiar to rent that agricultural products develop as values, i.e., that they confront other commodities as commodities themselves, and that the non-agricultural products confront them as commodities, like money, nor that they develop as particular expressions of social labor. What is peculiar is that with the conditions in which agricultural products develop as values, that is, commodities, and the conditions of realization of their values, landed property, also develops the power to appropriate a growing part of these values created without its assistance. And a growing part of the surplus value is transformed into rent. C, absolute ground rent, page 737. Differential rent should be treated before this section under B, and in examining the absolute ground rent under C, we presuppose this prior treatment. The transition from differential rent to absolute rent is to be made in the following way. In our analysis of differential rent, we proceeded from the premise that the worst land pays no ground rent. Or to put it more generally, land pays ground rent only when the individual production price of its product is below the production price that governs the market, giving rise to a surplus profit that is transformed into rent. The first thing to note here is that the law of differential rent as differential rent is entirely independent of the correctness or incorrectness of that premise. Now, if we call the general production price that governs the product P, then for the product of the worst type of land, P coincides with the individual real production price. The price, i.e. the price of the product pays for the constant and variable capital consumed in the course of production, plus the average profit equals profit of enterprise plus interest. Rent here is zero. The individual production price of the next better type of land is all Ricardian. Land of the second class, 2, equals P prime, and P is greater than P prime, i.e. P pays for more than the actual production price for the product of the land in class 2. Now let P dash P prime equals a sigma sigma, the excess of P over P prime. Thus the surplus profit made by the farmer in class 2. This is transformed into rent to be paid to the landowner, period. For the third class of land, let the actual production price be P double prime, so that P dash double prime equals 2 times sigma. That's not sigma, it's gamma. It is now transformed into rent. Similarly, for the fourth class, the individual production prices P triple prime and P dash triple prime equals 3 times gamma transferred into rent, and so on. Let us now assume that the premise of zero rent for land in the first class, for class 1, the price of the product being P plus 0, is incorrect. Instead, say that it pays a rent equals R, the lowercase. 2 things then follow. Firstly, the price of the product of class 1 would not be governed by its price of production, but would contain a surplus over and above this. It would be P plus R. For assuming the capitalist mode of production in its normal condition, i.e. assuming that the surplus R that the farmer pays to the landowner is neither a deduction from wages nor from the average profit of capital. He can pay it only by selling his product above its price of production, so that it would yield him a surplus profit if he did not have to part with his surplus to the landowner in the form of rent. The governing market price of the total product on the market from all types of land would then not be the price of production that capital generally yields in all spheres of production, i.e., a price equal to the outlays plus the average profit. It would be this production price plus the rent, P plus R, rather than just P. For the price of the product of class 1, land always represents the limit of the governing general market price, the price at which the total product can be supplied, and to this extent, it governs the price of this total product. Secondly, however, in this case, even though the general price of the product of the land would be basically modified, the law of differential rent would not in any way be thereby abolished. For if the price of the product of class 1, and therefore the general market price, was P plus R, the price for classes 2, 3, 4, etc., would be P plus R2, plus P plus R also. But since for class 2, P dash P prime equals gamma, gamma comma P plus R to P plus prime plus R would also be gamma, and similarly for class 3, etc. The differential rent would thus be the same as before and would be governed by the same law, even though the rent contained an element independent of this law and underwent a general rise together with the price of the product. It follows from this that whatever the rent on the least fertile land types of land might be, not only is the law of differential rent independent of it, but the only way to grasp the true character of differential rent itself is to set the rent for type 1 land at 0. Now, whether it really is 0 or greater than 0 is immaterial as far as the differential rent is concerned and does not need to be taken into account. The law of differential rent is thus unaffected by the result of the following analysis. If we now investigate more closely the basis of the assumption that the product of the poorest land, type 1, pays no rent, we get the following result. If the market price of the product, say corn, reaches such a level that an additional advance of capital invested in type 1 land pays the customary price of production, i.e., yields the customary average profit on the capital, this condition is sufficient for the investment of additional capital on type 1 land. That is to say, this condition is sufficient for the capitalist to invest new capital at the customary profit and to valorize it in the normal way, to the extent that he has to decide as a capitalist, the capitalist farmer on type 1 land can cultivate under these conditions. The conditions for the valorization of capital as capital on type 1 land is now present. But it in no way follows from the premise that capital could now be invested by the farmer on type 1 land under the average valorization conditions of capital, that is, if he had no rent to pay, that this land in type 1 is now immediately at the farmer's disposal as a field of application for his capital. The fact that the farmer could valorize his capital at the customary profit if he paid no rent is absolutely no reason for the landowner to lease out his land to the farmer for nothing and to be so philanthropic to his client as to extend him a credit gratuit. This assumption could involve abstracting from landed property, abolishing landed property whose very existence is a barrier to the investment of capital and its unrestricted valorization on the land, a barrier that in no way collapses in the face of the farmer's reflection that the level of corn prices would enable him to obtain the customary profit on his capital by exploiting type 1 land as long as he did not pay any rent, i.e., if he could actually treat landed property as non-existent. Differential rent presupposes precisely the monopoly of landed property. landed property is a barrier to capital, for otherwise the surplus profit would not be transformed into ground rent and would not accrue to the landlord instead of to the farmer. And landed property remains such a barrier even where rent in the form of differential rent disappears, i.e. on type 1 land. If we consider the cases where capital investment on the land can take place without payment of rent in a country of capitalist production, we shall find that they all involved a factual, if not also a legal, abolition of landed property, an abolition that can occur only under very special conditions of an accidental nature. Firstly, if the landowner is himself a capitalist or the capitalist himself a landowner. In this case, he can cultivate his land himself, or as soon as the market price has risen sufficiently to obtain the price of production from land, which at present belongs to type 1, i.e. to replace the capital advance plus the average profit. And why? Because as far as he's concerned, landed property does not set any barrier to the investment of his capital. He can treat the land as a simple natural element and let his decision be determined exclusively by considering the valorization of his capital by using capitalist considerations. Such cases do exist in practice, but only as exceptions, just as the capitalist cultivation of the land assumes a separation between functioning capital and landed property, so it generally rules out self-cultivation by the landed proprietor. We can see immediately this is purely accidental. If an increased demand for corn requires the cultivation of a greater extent of type 1 land than is to be found in the hands of self-cultivating proprietors, i.e., if one part of it has to be leased in order to be cultivated at all, this hypothetical abolition of the barrier that landed property places to the investment of capital immediately falls to the ground. It is an absurd contradiction to start from the separation between tenant farmer and landowner and between capital and land, which corresponds to the capitalist mode of production, and thus to assume the reverse as a general rule, i.e., to assume that the landowner is a self-cultivator wherever and to the extent that capital would draw no rent from cultivating the land if there were no landed property existing independently vis-a-vis capital. See the passage on rent of mines in Adam Smith. This abolition of landed property is accidental. It may occur or it may not. Secondly, the contents of a lease may include particular pieces of land that pay no rent at the given level of market prices and therefore rented out for nothing, though they're not viewed in this light by the landowner, since what he has his eye on is the total rental of the land leased and not the particular rent of particular component parts. In this case, the rent paid by the farmer for the investment of his capital disappears as far as these non-rent-bearing pieces of his farm are concerned, and with it, landed property is a barrier to the application of capital, and this is moreover by contract with the landowner himself. But the only reason why he pays no rent for these pieces of land is that he does pay rent for the land to which they are an accessory. In this case, the combination presupposed is precisely one in which he does not need to resort to the worst land of type 1 as an independent and new source of production in order to make up the missing supply. Instead, this type of land 1 simply forms an element of the farm inseparable from the better type of land. But the case that is to be investigated here is precisely that in which tracts of type 1 land are farmed independently and have therefore to be independently leased out under the general preconditions of the capitalist mode of production. Thirdly, a farmer may invest extra capital on his existing leasehold property, even though at the existing market prices, the additional product obtained in this way simply yields him the price of production, the customary profit, and does not enable him to pay an additional rent. Thus, for one part of the capital invested on the land, he does pay ground rent, for the other part he does not. But we can see from the following analysis how little this solves the problem. If the market price and also the fertility of the soil enables him to obtain a surplus yield with the additional capital, which, like the old capital, yields him a surplus profit as well as the price of production, then he pockets this profit himself for the duration of the lease. And why? Because as long as the tenancy lasts contractually, the barrier that landed property places to the investment of the capital in the land has been removed. Yet, the mere fact that in order to secure this surplus profit, he must take on additional worse land and lease it separately shows irrefutably that the investment of additional capital on the old land is not sufficient to produce the increased supply that is needed. The one assumption rules out the other. Now, one could say that the rent of the worst type of land, type 1, is itself a differential rent compared with the land cultivated by its own proprietor, even though this occurs only as a chance exception. Or with additional capital investment on the old leaseholds that do not yield any rent. Additional capital investment on the old leaseholds that do not yield any rent. This, however, would be a differential rent that did not arise from the differing fertility of different types of land and therefore did not presuppose that type 1 land paid no rent and that its product was sold at the price of production. Moreover, whether additional capital investments on the same leasehold land yield rent or not is as completely immaterial in determining whether the land in type 1 that is newly taken on pays rent or not, as it is immaterial. For example, for investment in a new and independent factory, whether another manufacturer in the same branch of production invests a part of his capital in interest-bearing paper, because this cannot be completely valorized in his own business, or whether he makes extensions to his factory that do not yield him the full profit, although they do yield more than the interest. As far as he is concerned, this is a secondary matter. But any new enterprise must yield the average profit and is set up on that expectation. Additional capital investments, 422, on the old leasehold properties, moreover, and the additional cultivation of new land of type 1 set barriers to each other. The limit up to which additional capital can be invested on the same leasehold under less favorable conditions of production is given by the competing new investments on type 1 land. On the other hand, the rent that this type of land can yield is limited by the competing additional capital investments on the old leaseholds. But none of these prevarications solves the problem, which, put simply, is as follows. Let us assume that the market price for the products of the soil is sufficient for portions of type 1 land to be taken into cultivation and for the capital invested to obtain the production price of the products from their new fields, i.e., the replacement of the capital that has been consumed, plus the average profit. Let us assume, therefore, that the conditions for normal valorization of capital on type 1 land are present. Will this suffice? Can this capital then really be invested? Or must the market price rise high enough for even the worst land to yield a rent? In other words, does the monopoly of landed property place a barrier to the investment of capital that would not be present from capital's own standpoint without the existence of this monopoly? The very terms of the question itself show how, if, for example, there are additional capital investments on old leaseholds that yield no rent at the prevailing market price, but simply the average profit, this in no way solves the problem of whether capital can now be invested on type 1 land, which would similarly yield the average profit, but no rent. This is precisely the question. It's clear from the need to take new land into cultivation that the additional capital investments which yield no rent do not satisfy the demand. If the additional cultivation of land of type 1 is undertaken only insofar as this yields rent, that is, yields more than the price of production, no more than two cases are possible. Either the market price must rise so far that even the final additional capital investments on the old leaseholds yield rent, whether this surplus profit is pocketed by the farmer or the landlord. This rise in price and yield of rent from the final additional capital investments would then be the result of the impossibility of cultivating land of type 1 unless rent is obtained thereby. For if the price of production, the yield of the average profit, pure and simple, was sufficient to induce cultivation, the price would not have risen so high, and new lands would have already come into competition as soon as they yielded these prices of production and no more. The additional capital investments on the old leaseholds that yielded no rent would then be faced with competition from the capital investments on land of type 1 that likewise yield no rent. Or alternatively, the final capital investments on the old leaseholds yield no rent, but the market price has still risen high enough for land of type 1 to be taken up and to yield rent. In this case, the additional capital investment that yielded no rent was possible only because the land of type 1 could not be cultivated until the market price allowed it to pay rent. In the absence of this condition, it would already have been cultivated at a lower price level, and those later investments of capital on the old leaseholds that need the high market price to yield the customary profit without rent would have not taken place. Given the high market price, they yield only the average profit at a lower price, which would have occurred when the price of production allowed land of type 1 to be cultivated. These investments would not have yielded this profit, and so they could not have taken place at all under this condition. The rent of type 1 land would thus form a differential rent compared with these capital investments on the old leaseholds that yield no rent, but the fact that it yields a differential rent of this kind is simply the result of its not being available for cultivation at all unless it yields a rent, i.e., unless there's a need for this rent, which is not determined by any difference in the types of land and which places a barrier to the possible investment of additional capitals on the old leaseholds. In both cases, the rent of type 1 land would not be the result of a rise in corn prices, but the opposite of this, the fact that the worse soil has to yield a rent for cultivation to be possible at all, would be the reason why corn prices rise to the point at which this condition can be fulfilled. Footnote 26. Whenever we say that type 1 land pays no rent, on the assumption that the corn price is governed by the price of production, we mean rent as a specific category. If the lease price paid by the farmer involves a deduction from the normal wages of his workers or from his own average profit, he does not pay any rent as an independent component of the price of his commodity distinct from wages and profit. We've already noted that this constantly happens in practice insofar as agricultural wages in a country are generally depressed below the normal average level so that there's a deduction from wages, with a part of the wage generally going into rent. This is not an exceptional case for the farmer on the worst land. His price of production already includes these low wages as a constituent item, and so the sale of product at his price of production does not enable the farmer of this land to pay a rent. The landlord can even lease out his land to a worker who is content to pay him in the form of rent everything, or the greater part of it, that the sale price yields him over and above his wages. In none of these cases is a genuine rent paid, even though a lease price is. Where relations corresponding to the capitalist mode of production exist, however, rent and lease price must coincide. Now, this is precisely the normal relationship which is to be examined here. Now, if our problem is not solved by the cases considered above, i.e., those in which capital investments can be made on the land in the capitalist mode of production without yielding rent, still less is it solved by making reference to colonial conditions. In speaking here of colonies, we always refer to colonies proper, that is, agricultural colonies. What makes a colony is not just the amount of fertile land to be found in its natural conditions, it's rather the circumstance that this land has not been appropriated. It has not been subsumed under landed property. This makes all the difference between the old countries and the colonies as far as land is concerned. The legal or factual non-existence of landed property, as Wakefield correctly notes, footnote 27, a fact already discovered long before him by Mirabeau, the physiocrat, footnote 28, and other early economists. It is completely immaterial here whether the colonists appropriate the land directly or whether they merely pay the state a tax in return for a valid legal title under the guise of a nominal land price. It is also immaterial that colonists already settled may be the legal owners of the land. Here, landed property actually forms no barrier to the investment of capital or of labor without capital. The seizure of part of the land by colonists already established does not prevent the newcomers from making new land into a field of investment for their own capital or their labor. Even in colonies, grants of big, uncultivated estates to particular individuals as their private property constitute a burdensome restriction on colonization, since they restrict the field of employment. And if this were done on a large scale, it would destroy the colony's character as a colony and would still do nothing to establish the conditions enjoyed by countries of ancient civilization there, as Wakefield has correctly remarked. Footnote 29. This point did not prevent the same Wakefield from advocating the establishment of an artificial land price in the colonies. Footnote 30. Thus, if we want to investigate how landed property affects the prices of its products and rent in cases where it restricts the land as a field of employment for capital to be invested, it is completely absurd to refer to free bourgeois colonies where neither the capitalist mode of production exists in agriculture nor the form of landed property corresponding to it. Indeed, where landed property does not exist at all in practice. Now, this is what Ricardo does, for example, in his chapter on rent, footnote 31. He starts by saying that he intends to analyze the effect of the appropriation of land on the value of its products, but immediately goes on to take the colonies as his illustration, assuming that land there is in a relatively elementary state and its exploitation not impeded by the monopoly of landed property. Legal ownership of the land by itself does not give the proprietor any ground rent. It certainly does give him the power, however, to withdraw his land from cultivation until economic conditions permit a valorization of it that yields him a surplus, whether the land is used for agriculture proper or for other productive purposes such as building, etc. He can neither increase nor reduce the absolute quantity of this field of employment, but he can affect the quantity of it on the market. It is a characteristic fact, therefore, and one which Fourier already noted, that in all civilized countries, a relatively significant portion of the land always remains uncultivated. Footnote 32. Assuming, then, that demand requires the taking up of new land, which is, say, less fertile than that previously cultivated, will the owner of this land lease it for nothing just because the market price of its product has risen high enough for capital investment to pay the farmer the price of production and thus yield him the customary profit? By no means. The capital investment must yield him a rent. He leases only when a lease price can be paid. The market price must therefore have risen above the price of production to P plus R so that a rent can be paid to the landowner, since by our assumption landed property does not bring anything without being leased, unleased land being economically worthless, a small rise in the market price above the price of production is sufficient to bring new land of the poorest kind onto the market. Now, the question now arises whether it follows from the ground rent of the poorest land, which cannot be derived from any difference in fertility, that the price of its product is necessarily a monopoly price in the customary sense, or a price that includes rent in the form of a tax, levied in this case by the landowner rather than the state. It is obvious that this tax has its given economic limits. It's limited by an additional capital investments on the old leaseholds. By competition from foreign agricultural product, we're assuming free trade, by competition between landed proprietors within the country, and finally by the needs of the consumers and their ability to pay. But this is not what is involved here. The question is whether the rent that is paid by the poorest land goes into the price of its product, which by our assumption is what governs the general market price, in the same way as a tax goes into the price of the commodity on which it is levied, i.e. as an element independent of its value. Now, this by no means follows necessarily, and it is asserted only because the distinction between the value of commodities and their price of production has as yet not been understood. We've already seen that the price of production of a commodity is not at all identical with its value, although the production prices of commodities, when considered in their totality, are governed only by their total value, and although the movement of production prices for commodities of different kinds, all other circumstances remaining the same, is determined exclusively by the movement of their values. it has been shown that the production price of a commodity may stand above or below its value, and it will only coincide with it in exceptional cases. But the fact that agricultural products are sold above their price of production by no means proves that they are also sold above their value, just as the fact that industrial products are sold on average at their price of production does not show that they are sold at their value. It is possible for agricultural products to be sold above their price of production and below their value, just as many industrial products yield their price of production only because they are sold above their value. The relationship of a commodity's price of production to its value is determined exclusively by the proportion between the variable part of the capital with which it is produced and the constant part, or in other words, by the organic composition of the capital producing it. If the composition of capital in one sphere of production is lower than that of the average social capital, i.e. of its variable, if its variable component that laid out on wages is greater in comparison with the average social capital than its constant component that laid out on the objective conditions of labor, the value of the commodity it produces must stand above its price of production. That is to say, such a capital produces more surplus value given the same exploitation of labor and therefore more profit than an equally large aliquot part of the average social capital because it applies more living labor. The value of its product therefore stands above its price of production. Since this price of production is equal to the capital that has been consumed, its cost of production plus the average profit, and the average profit is lower than the produced profit contained in this commodity. The surplus value produced by the average social capital is less than the surplus value produced by a capital of this lower composition. The reverse is true if the capital invested in a particular sphere of production is higher in composition than the average social capital. The value of the commodities it produces then stands below their price of production, which is generally the case with the products of the most highly developed industries. If the capital in a particular sphere of production has a lower composition than the average social capital, is firstly only a different expression for the fact that the productivity of social labor in this particular sphere of production stands below the average level of its development, for the level of productivity attained is expressed in the relative preponderance of the constant portion of capital over the variable, or in the steady decline of that component of a given capital laid out on wages. If the capital in a particular sphere of production has a higher composition, on the other hand, this expresses a level of development of the productivity of social labor, which stands higher than the average. Now, let me stop right there because I've run out of time. But I would note that this is an interesting moment because leaving aside actual artistic works which are excluded from our subject by the very nature of the case, it is self-evident that different spheres of production, according to their technical characteristics, require differing proportions of constant and variable capital, and that living labor must play a greater part in some and a smaller part in others. So anyway, and then he goes on to talk about extractive industry. So we'll stop right here, simply because we've run out of time. And I thank you for your attention. We've been looking at Fred Mosley's edited with an introduction of the Ben Folks translation of Marx's manuscripts of 1864 to 65. Let me thank you again for your attention. And we will continue doing this, sorry to say, for the current time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Sorry about that microphone problem.